For those who remember the Cold War or who enjoy TV spy thrillers, the current news cycle might sound familiar, but only to a point. We're going to be reviewing the charges and the connections of 29-year-old Maria Butina, accused of attempting to infiltrate the Republican Party. Announced right after Donald Trump wrapped up his press conference in Helsinki Monday with Vladimir Putin. While Butina was appearing in court Wednesday, the White House seemed to be seriously entertaining a Kremlin request to question former U.S. Ambassador to Moscow, Michael McFaul, as part of its campaign against investor-turned-activist Bill Browder, enough to still question, despite reversals, whether Trump believes Putin or his own government services. Contrast that confusion in Washington with the UK, where although authorities are downplaying claims of fresh leads in the latest Novichok poisonings, the overall response there has been unequivocal. Thus, the broader question: is it all just part of the old spy game, or do Western democracies face a whole new kind of threat? Today in the France 24 debate, we're wondering if Russia's outmaneuvering the West. And with us from Atlanta, Georgia, he's a former East German sleeper agent, Jack Barsky, whose autobiography, Deep Undercover, My Secret Life and Tangled Allegiances as a KGB Spy in America, is out. Thank you for joining us in the France 24 debate.
I'm glad to be with you.
We're also joined with us on set by Jeffrey Hawkins, former U.S. Ambassador to the Central African Republic.
Good evening.
And France 24 Chief International Affairs Editor Robert Parsons, a one-time Moscow Bureau Chief. How are you, sir?
Good.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, Russian embassy officials were to meet this Thursday with the jailed Maria Butina, the Siberian-born gun rights activist who denies wrongdoing and denounces what she calls anti-Russian hysteria. Ivana Skatola has the story.
This is the woman accused of trying to influence US politics as a spy for Russia. Maria Butina was charged by federal prosecutors on Monday with conspiring against the US government, failing to register as a foreign agent, and working to establish back-channel lines of communication for the Kremlin. Court documents accuse her of using sex and deception to establish influential connections in order to infiltrate US political organizations and gather intelligence for a senior Russian official. Accusations that Russia says look strange.
One gets the impression that somebody has taken a clock and calculated the best time to take the decision to arrest Maria Butina in order to do everything possible to undermine the positive outcome of the summit with the presidents of Russia and the United States. That's how it was all timed.
Court papers also say the 29-year-old used her contacts with the National Rifle Association, of which she is a lifetime member, to develop relationships with politicians, and that she had contacts for those working for Russia's federal security services. The FBI also observed her dining privately with a Russian diplomat suspected of being an intelligence operative last March. Her lawyer, Robert Driscoll, has denied the claims and says that she's been cooperating with the US government for several months. She was jailed pending trial after appearing in court on Wednesday. The charges against her are not related to the ongoing US inquiry into Russian election meddling.
Jack Barsky, what do you make of this case?
I believe that this case is a legitimate case of somebody trying to do a little bit of espionage. Based on this, what I've been able to determine from what's in the media, I don't believe she was a trained operative. I mean, trained agents don't communicate via email or Twitter. But again, based on what I've heard, she was one heck of an amateur. She clearly outdid me in terms of effectiveness. She got to people. It was amazing the pictures she took with all kinds of high-level, reasonably highly placed officials in the Republican Party. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, because your orders, if I'm correct, back in the day, were to get close to the then National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, which you were unable to do.
Yeah, that was a bit of a dream. This Brzezinski thing was a bit overplayed because I mentioned that name once as an example. I was supposed to get close to politicians, decision makers, or people close to decision makers. Was not in a position to do so based on my lowly standing in American society. This lady had obviously, in this respect, a head start. And apparently she played a role really, really well. I do believe that this is a legitimate espionage case, no matter what the Russians say. They will deny it until, in face of the hardest evidence you can come up with.
Yeah, because she's plucked, according to the news reports. Now maybe they're embellishing a bit, but she's plucked out of obscurity from Siberia. And brought to the U.S. and, as you say, fast-tracked into all these meetings. Our own correspondent in Washington recalls meeting her just before the U.S. elections in 2016.
Well, I wouldn't plucked out. I wouldn't take that literally. Obviously she's a bright person. She came over here to study. You don't know. At one point, she was most likely approached by FSB or GRU, two of the secret services. And interestingly enough, the one thing I found in the media that she had some interaction with the former ambassador Kislyak. Now, Kislyak got his first assignment as a diplomat was to be in the Soviet mission to the United Nations. That Soviet mission to the United Nations was at least half of the personnel was KGB. So we got some interesting connections there.
And Jack Barsky, your reaction, you heard the in that report, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson saying, questioning the timing of it, that the Justice Department announces this arrest after having followed Butina for months and announces it just after that summit had concluded between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump.
I heard that. I have only one answer. What positive outcome? There was a lot of nicety exchange in the press conference. Positive outcome means you agreed to do something jointly. There was no agreement of any kind that has been published. So I believe that to be nonsense. I believe that to be not politically motivated as some other events in the espionage realm have been, in my view, recently. But this one I think is straightforward. You know what happens when a decision is made to strike, because before you strike, you observe, you want to see what's going on, you want to anticipate, you want to limit damage. When you make a decision to actually apprehend somebody, you have a good reason for doing so, and that reason may well come out, and maybe it doesn't. But I'm really skeptical these days with regard to the mixing of politics. Even internationally, that includes Great Britain and Germany and so forth. The mixing of politics with intelligence, that is never a good idea, because politicians are pulling stuff out of the underworld that really you never know whether it's true or not. And that is like oil and water. But I do believe that this one is a legitimate case.
Jeffrey Hawkins, because she was arrested, like literally in the hour that after the conclusion of that press conference. The Justice Department, at least for the day, held off until they'd finished speaking to reporters.
Yeah, keep in mind, this has been a week of Justice Department action against accused spies. And this is not an isolated case. As we know, just last week on Friday, the Mueller investigation brought indictments against 12 GRU agents. And one thing I'd like to emphasize for you and your viewers is this is not like shadowy intelligence, he said, she said, we think. This is the estimation of the intelligence community. These are indictments. These are investigations led by the Justice Department, and this is the Justice Department saying we have enough evidence, we believe, to prove these cases in a court of law. And that's not equivocal. That's not, oh, maybe it's the Russians, maybe it's a 400 guy on his bed. These are cases Justice Department is quite confident that they can take to court and win. And that is a very big deal.
I'm going to get back to this issue of timing once more, because some people even describe it as the Justice Department picking that particular day as a message not to the Russians, but to the U.S. president, saying, look, the judicial branch of government is still doing its job.
Yeah, and we mentioned it earlier, but keep in mind that this latest indictment against Butina is not the Mueller investigation. This is just the regular old Justice Department bringing this indictment. Now it's the same people in charge, and the Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein, and ultimately, perhaps I suppose, if he wasn't recused on this as well, the Attorney General. But they need to be clear with the American people that there is a real and clear and present danger from the Russian intelligence services to our democratic system in the United States. And I think it wouldn't be unreasonable to suggest that maybe timing here was important.
The British news agency Press Association this Thursday, quoting British police as identifying several Russians who they believe were behind the nerve agent attack on former spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter. Those sources say investigators painstakingly pored over closed-circuit television footage. Now, the security minister in the UK, Ben Wallace, is dismissive. He says those claims belong to, quote, the ill-informed and wild speculation folder. Your thoughts when you follow the Skripal investigation, Robert Parsons, in comparison with the investigations, plural, that Jeffrey Hawkins has just described?
Well, two completely different things, obviously. The British approach is obviously going to be much more trying to find the right word for it. It's not subtle, but it's they clearly what they're dealing with is something completely different. Trying to trace the trails in many respects is going to be more difficult. Whether or not the security minister is right about the CCTV, it's clear that that's one of the trails the investigation is going to be following. Where that leak has come from, whether it's substantial or not, who knows? But from what I've read, and that's all I've been doing, the investigation does seem to be making progress. It's not the long investigation you're seeing in the United States, where there are thousands of threads and the investigation is picking one by one and trying to draw them together. It's a vastly complicated investigation, which has already taken over a year and is likely to take considerable more time as well. But, obviously both bring together a common concern that the Russian government is meddling in the political systems of Western democratic governments with the aim of undermining Western democracies.
Jack Barsky, is this any different from what we saw in the past?
Fundamentally not, but what I hinted at before is what is different nowadays. We are playing out too much of this stuff in public. And a couple of thoughts with regard to what my two predecessors just said. The indictment of the 12 GRU officials, to me, is as phony as a $3 bill. Simply because Mueller and his folks, Mueller and his folks knew that this would never, ever come to trial. So you really don't even have to prove. This makes no sense. This makes absolutely no sense to indict a dozen folks who are outside of the country. And even if you were to try in absentia, you most likely would have to disclose sources where you get the information from, because GRU officials don't run around with a badge on some place that says GRU, and if and when they do hack, they are not clearly identified as such. I remind there's a British fellow in this round here. I remind folks of the hesitance by the British government to put Kim Philby on trial in the 50s, when it was quite clear that he was spying for the Russians, because they were afraid that too much nonsense will come out in public. So the the indictment against those 12, to me, had reasons other than securing or increasing security for the United States.
Yeah, so
the
it's
Skripal case.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say your point about it being
case,
easier to with everything being more mediatized, it's easier to make noises that are distractions, is what you're saying.
You're absolutely right, and there's a lot of political football being played when it comes to that kind of stuff, and it appears to be fashionable these days to make the Russians as the only bad boy on the planet. In the meantime, I have some, connections. There are unofficial connections to American secret services such as the FBI. The Chinese are doing just as much spying as the Russians, if not more. It's just not politically advantageous these days to bring that out in the open. So that's why anytime a politician opens their mouth, left or right or wherever, and to talk about espionage, I am extremely, extremely suspicious.
Just one brief word, Jeffrey Hawkins.
Yeah, well, actually, if I can respond to two of those points. First, on the everybody does it. The whataboutism that we often see in American politics. There's a big difference between espionage, which everybody does, we do, and active measures. And taking active measures against our democratic systems are in a whole different category and deserve a robust response, not only from the intelligence services, but from the government as a whole, and including our political leadership. As concerns this being a fake like a $3 bill, no, obviously Mueller has no expectation whatsoever that Russia is going to extradite these 12 GRU agents, just as I hope we're not going to be sending Ambassador McFaul to Russia. But what he does need to do, and he did it in a 30-page indictment that is fairly detailed, he does need to lay out legally the case for the Russian spying. So as he starts going after actors that he can get his hands on, that case has been made already.
All right, I want to thank Jack Barsky for joining us for part one. Part two, we're going to be going over the allegations against the former U.S. ambassador to Moscow. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at allegations and ambivalence when it comes to spying between Russia and the West, particularly the United States. With us to talk about it, he is a former East German sleeper agent from Atlanta, Georgia, Jack Barsky, whose autobiography is entitled Deep Undercover, My Secret Life and Tangled Allegiances as a KGB Spy in America. Also with us, the former U.S. ambassador to the Central African Republic, the American Library here in Paris, Jeffrey Hawkins. Thank you for being with us. And as well, our Chief International Affairs Editor, Robert Parsons. Now, Robert, you were at that Helsinki summit on Monday where Vladimir Putin openly suggested the questioning of the investor turned activist Bill Browder, who's something of his bête noire. Since then, the Russian Prosecutor General's office listing Americans it wants to question for, quote, illegal activities. They include the former ambassador to Moscow, Michael McFaul. He tweeted in response, I hope the White House corrects the record and denounces in categorical terms this ridiculous request from Putin. Not doing so creates moral equivalency between a legitimate U.S. indictment of Russian intelligence officers and a crazy, completely fabricated story invented by Putin. Well, here's what happened when the question was asked at the White House press briefing.
The president's going to meet with his team, and we'll let you know when we have an announcement on that.
For a second, is that a topic that came up in their conversation? Did President Putin raise this with President Trump?
There was some conversation about it, but there wasn't a commitment made on behalf of the United States, and the president will work with his team, and we'll let you know if there's an announcement on that front.
Jeffrey Hawkins, the State Department corrected afterwards, but what's your reaction to that?
Well, first of all, I mean, I am keenly aware of the irony of this because, of course, Ambassador McFaul, Mike McFaul, was one of the architects of Obama's reset with Russia at the time, and at a time when the Obama administration was really looking to improve relations that had gotten pretty bad. When he got to Russia, for a number of reasons, a lot of many of the dossiers that we are dealing with really prevented that reset from ever happening. But this was somebody that actually wanted good relationships with Russia before he went out to Moscow. The idea that a former ambassador, a former representative of the President of the United States and the American people would be somehow handed over to agents in a foreign country for questioning certainly sends a chill down my spine as a former ambassador. But
do you put it down to, I don't know, inexperience on the part of Sarah Huckabee Sanders, or do you think she's serious when she says, well, they're considering the request?
Well, I mean, it appears, because they discussed it in the press conference, that President Putin and President Trump talked about this. From the press report,
President Trump said it was a brilliant idea. Something along those lines.
And from press reports, apparently Putin sort of couched it in terms of, when he made massive contributions to the Clinton, illegal contributions to the Clinton campaign, Browder, and somehow McFaul is wrapped up in all of this.
Speaking of him, Bill Browder now joins us, the author of Red Notice, founder of Hermitage Capital Management. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. Your thoughts on the exchange we heard from the White House on Wednesday?
It's got to be the lowest point in the Trump presidency that I can remember. Here you have an evil dictator, a murderous dictator, who is who's been proven to have done all sorts of atrocities all over the world, including killing my lawyer Sergei Magnitsky. Asking for the people who have been involved in one way or another in trying to hold him to account to basically be handed over to the Russian authorities. And if I were to be handed over, I would be killed in Russia. But what's in a certain way more shocking about this is that there's 10 U.S. citizens on this list who are other than the ambassador, who everybody knows. There's a number of nameless people that who have been toiling away on behalf of the U.S. government in Congress, in the State Department, in the Department of Homeland Security, fighting Russian organized crime, fighting Putin's bad actions. And now the President of the United States is going to hand over people who have been in the service of the United States government for their country to the Russians who they've been trying to stop. So it's the most absurd thing I've ever heard.
So, Bill Browder, this is a serious show. This isn't the conspiracy hour. So just tell us, what do you think? Why is Donald Trump talking the way he talked on Monday about it being a great idea?
It's not the conspiracy hour, so I'm not going to engage in any conspiracy theories. All I can say is that on one hand, his administration has been absolutely appropriate and tough on Russia. Mike Pompeo, Nikki Haley, Jim Mattis, all of the people who work around him have been tough on Russia. They've been supplying weapons to Ukraine. They've been sanctioning Russian oligarchs. They've been attacking Russian mercenaries in Syria. It's a real proper policy towards Russia. But then you get this individual, the President of the United States, in a secret meeting with the President of Russia and coming up with this nonsense. It raises every question. This is effectively a litmus test for Donald Trump.
What conclusion do you draw? Why does he act the way he acts, Donald Trump?
I can't interpret his behavior. I don't think anyone can. It's odd. It's insane. It doesn't make any sense, and it's not in the U.S. national interest. And so he's going on and on about making America great again and America first. It's not America first to hand over 10 loyal servants, patriotic servants of the United States who have been trying to protect the United States from Russia to the Russian gangsters. Doesn't make any sense.
Robert Parsons, you were in Helsinki on Monday. What did you make of the president's words and his demeanor there?
I mean, I completely agree with Bill Browder. It makes absolutely no sense at all. And perhaps there's almost no sense in trying to make sense of what Donald Trump says. One thing that I was sure of when I went to Helsinki was that Donald Trump was going to come up with something pretty eccentric, and sure enough, he did. Given the opportunity to charge President Putin, a perfect opportunity, the way the question was posed to him at the press conference, to charge President Putin with interference in the U.S. elections, he did exactly the opposite and said, although he went back on it later, and said, I can see no reason why President Putin would have wanted to do that. It was extraordinary. One realized at that point, if his real intention had ever been to turn a page with the Russians, that he was undermining that immediately by saying those words. So one has to question, first of all, does he really know what he's doing? Is he aware of the position that he really holds? And does he take it sufficiently seriously to be in that position? And if not, I mean, what are these people around him? Why can't they control them? We heard Bill Browder mentioning all those people like Mike Pompeo, Jim Mattis, all heavyweight people who understand perfectly well what the Russian government is doing at the moment. Why can't they control them?
Ultimately, you heard Bill Browder say U.S. institutions are still doing their job. Does this upend the world order as we've known it since the Second World War?
Not yet, no. But the risk will be that Donald Trump will so dismantle the architecture that's been put into place since the end of the Second World War that when it's all over, when he departs the political stage, it will take an immense effort to put it back together again.
And we're not talking here about one isolated summit, one interaction with Putin. I mean, just in the last week or 10 days alone, a disastrous NATO summit, that visit to the UK where his Sun interview undercut Prime Minister May's efforts to seek a soft exit from the EU. And then comments subsequent to the summit where he was talking about Montenegro responding to a question from a Fox News correspondent and calling into question Article 5, which is the bedrock of the NATO alliance, which serves our interests. And by the way, as an aside, the only time Article 5 has ever been invoked was to support us in Afghanistan. There is a wider context of attacking international institutions of which the United States was the architect, and then interacting in a way with the Russian president, with others, that suggests complacent at best.
Jack Barsky, the one-on-one meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, some including Jeffrey Hawkins here present, alarmed by the fact that there was nobody else in the room. Are we overreacting?
Not really. I don't have too much substantial here to act. First of all, I'm glad that Mr. Browder joined us, because I was going to try to make the case that has to do with the Magnitsky Act and why Putin hates Mr. Browder so much. I read his book, Red Notice. It's a phenomenal book, and it if anybody wants to know what this system, the Putin system, is like, read that book. Anyway, I can only say one word to this whole thing: bizarre. And with regard to what happened between them one-on-one, I think it was just a bunch of nonsense, because ultimately one lies and the other doesn't remember what he said yesterday. So the reality is this is sort of a unreal, and has nothing to do with reality. Everything that was talked about and that press conference almost, it was atrocious. That's only one word I can say. I am worried about.
I seem to have lost the connection there. Apologies with Atlanta, Georgia. We'll try to reconnect. Let's go to Moscow. Andrei Kortunov is Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. Ultimately, let's not look at the short term, at the news cycle, but in the long run, has this been a good or a bad week for Russia?
Well, it's hard to tell, because I think that initially the perception in Moscow was that we finally got on the right track, because some contacts can be unfrozen, and some communication lines can be restored, and probably some dialogue on regional issues and also on arms control can be activated. But now, given the reaction in Washington, D.C., it's not clear whether anything will follow, and whether indeed this relationship got any better after the meeting in Helsinki. I think that Moscow did not expect such a fierce reaction to the first bilateral summit meeting.
Didn't expect such a fierce reaction. The headlines, there was one in the UK in the Daily Mirror, which had a picture of Trump with the headline, Putin's poodle. Ultimately, that you're suggesting, Andrei, doesn't play in Russia's favor.
Well, it doesn't play in the favor of the American political system or the Western political system. Is where if president who was elected by the American people is portrayed as a poodle, well, that's not good.
I could just say one thing which sort of backs up in a way what Andrei has been saying. One of the main Russian newspapers, Moskovsky Komsomolets, sort of make a similar sort of point, said, it's clear that Putin outmaneuvered Donald Trump. And that was a cause of concern for many, of pride rather, for many Russians. But outmaneuvering Donald Trump doesn't mean outmaneuvering the American political elite. And if you alienate the American political elite, you create problems for yourself in the long term. And that perhaps is the alley, that the dead end that the Russian political establishment has got itself in at the moment.
All right, lots of reactions on the
Well,
Go ahead, Andrei.
I don't think that the goal of Mr. Putin was to outmaneuver Mr. Trump. Mr. Putin, whatever can be said about him, is not stupid. And he understands that Donald Trump remains his best, if not the only friend that he can count on in Washington, D.C. Why should Putin try to outmaneuver Donald Trump? I think that it would be more logical to imagine that Mr. Putin would like to help Donald Trump and to offer him something that Donald Trump can sell back at home. Probably Mr. Putin was not generous enough to offer Trump something bigger than he actually did. I think that Putin limited himself to ideas about, for example, exercising certain pressure on Iran to make sure that the security interests of Israel will be respected. Maybe there were some other minor concessions. The question is whether these concessions were enough for Donald Trump to declare victory.
Bill Browder, do you agree with that analysis?
Well, I would say that putting aside what Putin got from Donald Trump, if one of Putin's biggest issues is the Magnitsky Act, which is what he seemed to indicate it was by bringing me up as this bargaining chip with Trump, it's blown up in his face tremendously, because by making me into the central figure, or one of the central figures coming out of this thing, I've been getting emails from all over the world from politicians and government officials who were considering a Magnitsky Act, who had never thought, well, we kind of like the idea, but is it really effective? And Vladimir Putin has been my best advocate for showing how effective it is, to show how upset he is by this Magnitsky Act. And so we will get more Magnitsky Acts for sure because of this summit and because of his conduct in the summit. Whatever other objectives he had, that one just blew up in his face big time.
All right, we've been talking about international relations here, and the consensus is against Donald Trump on this one throughout this discussion. But what if we looked at it through the prism of U.S. domestic politics? There was an online survey of 3,000 people published by Axios and SurveyMonkey. It shows that 40% of Americans still back Donald Trump, including 79% of Republicans. And you've expressed the fact that you're shocked and appalled. He didn't stand up for his own State Department, his own agencies. 40% of Americans are okay with that, Jeffrey Hawkins.
And you can go further. I read some statistics recently that said 40% of Republicans believe, only 40% believe we should be in NATO. I mean, Trump has very successfully, at least with his base, called into question some of the fundamental
principles. Is it Donald Trump who's right and in that respect?
I think he is certainly able to take actions on the international stage in a way that doesn't lose him his base. There are many things that President Trump does, and they're easily explicable for political reasons, whether you agree with them or disagree with them, different subject. This one
but is the United
a complete
States changing?
Mystery.
Is the United States changing? Where
I don't
NATO...
think there's a groundswell of support in the United States for improved relations with Russia at the expense of our relations with France and Germany and Canada. No, I don't think so. I think this is something This is an agenda that my suspicion is this is an agenda that is the president's alone or a very small group around him that his base is willing to follow. But we're also seeing the American political class, and that includes some Republicans, maybe not as many as we might hope, who have been extremely critical. Somebody like McCain, who called the performance this week in Moscow a disgrace, the most disgraceful he'd ever seen from a U.S. president.
Robert Parsons, here in France, we have seen over the past decade the conservative right, very Atlantist. Remember Nicolas Sarkozy, when he became president, going on vacation in New Hampshire? Yeah. Today, he is praiseworthy of Russia and of Vladimir Putin, and a lot of people on the French right are like that, and some even on the French left.
It is interesting the way the
so
French
why
political
is there this
establishment
shift? Is it and
well,
how,
I think
how far does the shift?
You only have to look across at the Atlantic, I think, to understand where the shift is coming from. People here are beginning, as elsewhere in the European Union, are beginning to look at the United States and say, is this an ally that we can completely trust? And should we completely trust it? Perhaps we need to put our eggs in some other baskets as well, rather than put them all in the US basket. I was on a visit with Emmanuel Macron, the French president, to St. Petersburg, not very long ago, where he met Vladimir Putin. And many of the things he said seemed to suggest exactly that France was reconsidering its international alliances. And there were many things in which France could see eye to eye with Russia. So, I think what's happening in the United States is having a knock-on effect. I wouldn't push that boat out too far at this stage. I think it's early days, and I think, once Donald Trump has gone, if he hasn't completely destroyed the post-war architecture, there will be many opportunities to row back. But it's beginning to happen.
Bill Browder, do you agree with that the old Cold War East versus West construct doesn't exist anymore? All right, we seem to have lost the connection with Bill Browder. I'll put the question before we leave to Jack Barsky.
You lost my connection as well for a while. I think I was going to say what I'm really worried about. I think there's somebody doing some sabotage. What I was going to say is I'm worried about Trump losing some of the level-headed individuals he has surrounded himself with. But I was thinking the same thing when you asked that question. It looks like the lines that were really clearly drawn, very hard drawn during the Cold War, are getting fuzzy. That is not in the best interest of the West. And if you want to summarize who is winning in this, it would be Vladimir Putin. And we are doing internally in the United States a great job of fighting with one another. And now we're starting to sort of having a lot of disagreements amongst NATO. That is not, and I repeat this, not in the best interest of the West.
Jack Barsky, I want to thank you for joining us from Atlanta. I want to thank as well Bill Browder, Andrei Kortunov for being with us from Moscow, Jeffrey Hawkins, Robert Parsons. Stay with us. Media Watch is next.